Good afternoon. Welcome to Aristotle on the Soul. The topic we are going to talk about is very important. The famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant said that there are three most fundamental problems in philosophy. What he calls postulates or requirements of the practical reason. And these are the existence of God, the freedom of the will, and the immortality of the soul. The existence of God, the freedom of the will, and the immortality of the soul. Of the three, the immortality of the soul is the most difficult. However, we can say that all peoples in every generation have believed in the soul. With very few exceptions. One exception is one branch of Buddhism. But all other great religions all believe in the existence of the soul. The soul, as you know, is the principle of life. The Greek word for soul is psyche, which gives us in English psychology, psychological, and I'm sure in Georgian probably also something similar. Now, from the earliest times, the Greek peoples all understood that life is something different from what is not living. And they thought that you cannot reduce life to what is not living. So, if we ask the question, how do we know that there is such a thing as soul? The answer that Aristotle would give, and that I would give, is that we can know that there is soul from teleology. So last week we talked about the four causes of Aristotle. You remember the fourth cause which Aristotle added, which is the final cause. This final cause is the good which moves without being moved.
ეს არის მიზნობრივი მიზეზი, რომელიც მოძრაობანი მოძრაობის გარეშე.
So something can move without itself being moved.
რაღაცა შეიძლება მოძრაოს თვითონ თავისი მოძრაობის გარეშე, თვითონ არ იყოს მოძრაობა ის.
You remember the example of the chocolate that moves me to go and buy it in the shop. For Aristotle, everything alive is seeking two things. Namely, its full development or perfection, and also to stay in this best condition for as long as possible. And the only explanation he can give for this desire is that living things are seeking the goodness and the eternity of God. So God is the final cause, the goodness that all living things are seeking. And this desire explains the way they behave. So all living things feed themselves. They defend themselves against predators. They heal themselves when they are injured. As we said, they strive for their best possible condition. And finally, in order to survive after their death, they reproduce. Living things are aware that they cannot live forever. And so they want to leave something of themselves behind after they are dead. And I talked in my lecture last Thursday about the fact that you don't need to have intellect for this purpose. So even plants and animals seek to achieve their eternity. And this striving is found not in an intellect but in the soul. So it is important to know that we don't know the soul exists from the activities of living beings. As most people think. It is the opposite. We know that these activities are required in order to achieve the striving for the good. In order to achieve full development and eternity, all living things behave in a certain way. Now, the biggest problem in regard to the soul is, of course, that you can't see it. And therefore, the soul is not something material. You can't find soul if you put something living under a microscope. So, of course, the question is whether it is reasonable to accept that there is this immaterial principle. So the question is a little bit like the question of the existence of God. God is also immaterial. So this is our question. Do we accept that there is the immaterial principle of the soul, just as we accept that there is an immaterial God? Now, it is an interesting point that the earliest philosophers did not have the concept of immaterial. It's not that they didn't believe in it, they simply didn't have the idea. The first philosopher to believe in the concept of the immaterial is Plato. We can see just before Plato that the philosopher Anaxagoras is trying to find the idea. But Plato is the first philosopher to have a word for immaterial. And the only other philosopher in pre-Christian times to have the concept of the immaterial is So after Aristotle, the first philosopher to have the concept of the immaterial, or to accept the concept of the immaterial, is in the 1st century BC. But there are no great philosophers in the 1st century BC, so we're really talking about the 1st century AD. Namely, the philosopher Philo of Alexandria. Now, the earliest Greek philosophers were aware that there are many mysterious powers at work in nature. And I mentioned to you that they thought that matter is living in a way. And also that they thought that there are gods at work behind the powerful forces of nature. The first philosopher, Thales, thought that everything is full of gods and soul. So by which he means there are mysterious, superhuman forces at work in nature. It took some time then for the earliest philosophers to have a clearer idea of the meaning of soul. Also, the earliest Greek peoples had an idea of the soul surviving after death. But it was not really the personality of the person who survived after death, it was a kind of a shadow of the person. And if you read the great poet Homer, the first great Greek author, you will see how he describes life after death in the underworld in Hades. The first Greek philosopher to have the idea of a soul as the most important part of the human being is Pythagoras. Yes. The first Greek philosopher to have the idea of the soul as the most important part of the human being is Pythagoras. Part of the human being. And I mentioned to you last week how Pythagoras believed in the reincarnation of the soul. Human beings will only escape from the cycle of reincarnation if they lead a good life. And this good life for Pythagoras is a life of contemplation, which for Pythagoras consisted to a large extent in listening to music and doing mathematics. And also, for Pythagoras, it is necessary to purify the soul by leading an ascetic life. That's a difficult word. Leading a strict form of life. Not to eat certain kinds of food and not to have luxury. And if you do not do this, then your soul will be reincarnated. And this is a kind of punishment. Your soul will come back as the soul of some kind of animal. And your soul will keep coming back until such time as finally it is purified and can go to some kind of a heaven. This tradition was continued, as I mentioned last week, by Heraclitus, Empedocles, and Plato. And the important point is that in order to achieve immortality of the soul, it was always necessary to purify the soul by leading two aspects of life.
Sulis
So a negative aspect and a positive aspect. So the negative aspect is you have to lead a pure way of life, avoid luxuries, a pure way of life. You have to purify your soul. Negative, yes. So what we call an ascetic way of life, the way of life of the monk in the monastery. And then the positive side is to lead a life to lift up the soul, so a life of contemplation and intellectual life. And the way of life of the philosopher. Now, I mentioned that all philosophers believed in the existence of the soul. Even the materialist philosophers, such as Democritus and later the Stoa, they all believed in the existence of the soul. So they thought there must be some kind of principle to explain life. So for Democritus, everything in the world is made of atoms. And so you might be surprised that he believed that there is a soul. But he did. He believed that the soul is also made of atoms. And because the function of the soul is to explain life, he says that the atoms of the soul are very fine, round atoms. And they move around the body extremely fast. And that is why we feel it very quickly. If somebody stands on my toe, I feel it very quickly. Because these small round atoms are moving very quickly from my toe to my brain where I feel. And also the Stoic school of philosophy also believed in the existence of the soul. The Stoic school believed, like Heraclitus, that everything is made of fire. And so they believed also that the soul is made of fire. And of course, that helps to explain why living beings are born. Okay, that sounds a little bit primitive, but the soul, they had the intuition that the soul is something fiery. So we come then to the question of a more refined understanding of the soul. Probably the first philosopher to understand the soul as the personality of the human being is Socrates. So Socrates believed in a personal immortality. He did not believe in the reincarnation of the soul, that the soul would keep coming back and back. And you may know that he is very famous because he spent the last day of his life before he was executed talking about the immortality of the soul. This conversation is recorded by his pupil Plato in his work The Phaedo. Now, the first philosopher to examine the soul in detail is Plato. Plato divides the soul into three parts. He has a very famous image of the soul in his work The Phaedrus. His work The Phaedrus. Phaedrus. P-H-A-E-D-R-U-S. Phaedrus. And in that work he says that there are three parts of the soul. So if you like, three aspects of life. The most important part of the soul is the rational part. And he compares the rational part of the soul to a charioteer. A charioteer who drives a chariot, yes. Yes, he compares the rational part of the soul
ნაწილს სულის იგი ატარებს მეტყლეს, ისაც შევიდეთ და
So the job of the charioteer is to drive the chariot.
მეტყლის სამშაო არის ის რომ ატაროს.
And this chariot is pulled by two horses. A good horse and a bad horse. And the good horse he compares to the drive, the impulse for life in everything alive. So everything alive wants to stay alive. So this, he says, is the good horse, and he says it's not too difficult to direct it in the right direction. But the bad horse, he says, is the passions or the desires of the soul. And of course, it's very difficult to control the passions or the desires. The bad horse is trying all the time to upset the chariot. And so the job of the charioteer is to control the two horses in such a way that the chariot will make progress. Now, for Plato, the soul is not at home in the body. Not at home. The body for Plato is like a prison. So the soul does not want to be in the body. The soul for Plato is similar to an idea. You remember that for Plato there is another world of ideas. And this other world of ideas is the real world. The soul is like an idea, but it's not an idea. And one of the big differences is that there are many souls, but there's only one idea of each thing. But the soul is at home in the other world of ideas. And it desires to be separated from the body in order to return to the other world of ideas. So heaven for Plato is to be found in the other world, contemplating the ideas. And because the soul is immaterial, it is real, and it can continue to exist after the death of each living thing. Now, for Plato, at the start, the three parts of the soul are immaterial, are immortal. But later in his life, he decided that probably only the intellectual part of the soul was immortal. So that is his view in his work, the Timaeus. Timaeus, which is his work on cosmology, on physics, if you like. Now, Plato gives an important argument for the immortality of the soul. Namely, that it's necessary for the soul to be immortal in order for the good to be rewarded and for the bad to be punished. And this is a very important argument which will be taken up again by later philosophers. It's an argument taken up by St. Augustine, by Thomas Aquinas, by Kant. St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and Kant. So some of the most important philosophers. Of course, this argument is based on the idea that there is great perfection in the universe. And for Christian philosophers, of course, the world must be very perfect, because it is the work of God. And therefore, there has to be a great deal of order in the world. And it would be against the order in this universe if the bad people could prosper both in this world without punishment, while good people suffer in this world and do not get a reward. So therefore, the order in the universe shows us that there must be this justice. So that is a very important argument. Now, Aristotle inherited this tradition from Plato. And we will see what he did with this tradition. So the first point is that the study of the soul for Aristotle falls under the study of physics. Because the soul is something real and at the same time something that can move. something that can move and change. And physics, I think I may have mentioned, is the second most important science for Aristotle. You remember that the best science is metaphysics, and there are just three real sciences, namely metaphysics, physics, and mathematics. Now, the soul is found in all living beings. And Aristotle, we will see, is completely different from Plato in regard to the immortality of the soul. For Aristotle, there is no life after death. At least it is not generally clear that there could be any life after death for Aristotle. There are some passages which show that he is still thinking a little bit like Plato. But he does not talk at all about a life after death. And he does not talk about any punishment after death for people who lead a bad life or a reward for people who lead a good life. For Aristotle, if you lead a bad life, then your punishment will be that you lose your happiness. And of course, if you lead a good life, then your reward will be happiness. Now, Plato, you remember, did not believe that human beings are a unity. You remember that he even said the soul is in the body like in a prison. For Aristotle, the situation is exactly the opposite. The soul is at home in the body, and human beings are a unity. Now, Aristotle inherited the tradition of dividing the soul into three parts from Plato. But he soon made changes. In his Nicomachean ethics that we talked about, he still talks about three parts of the soul. And for me, this is strong evidence that this ethical work is one of his earliest works.
და ეს არის ის ყარდასტური, რომ ესეთი კურინაშრომი არის ისე ადრეული შრომა.
Because very soon he divides the soul into 4 parts. We find this division into 4 parts in his Eudemian ethics and in his politics. So these 4 parts you will see are more satisfactory than Plato's 3 parts. For Aristotle, the lowest, so the least important part of the soul is the part that human beings have in common with plants. It's the part of the soul that explains why plants and also animals and human beings, why they feed themselves, why they defend themselves, why they heal themselves, and why they reproduce. So Aristotle believed that you need a part of the soul to explain these characteristics of plants as well as animals and human beings. Aristotle believed that you need this part of the soul and this is more satisfactory than Plato's lowest part of the soul, which is the part that represents the passions or the desires. Because Plato doesn't really have a part of the soul that represents these characteristics of plants. Then Aristotle says that all animals and human beings have a second part of the soul. And this is the part of the soul that explains perception. So all animals have perception. Some of them only have the sense of touch. But the highest animals, the more developed animals, all have 5 senses. And nowadays we know that even some fish have a 6th sense, the electric sense. So the second part of the soul for Aristotle is the part that explains sensation or perception. Now, Aristotle says that human beings have, in addition, the intellect. So the intellect for Aristotle corresponds with the charioteer for Plato. But Aristotle divides the intellect into two parts. The first of these two parts is the practical part. So the part of the soul that human beings use in order to deliberate. In order to think about what they ought to do. And in order to put into practice the virtues. So this, for Aristotle, requires a special part of the soul. But for Aristotle, this is not the most important part of the soul. Because there is a fourth part, an additional part, which is devoted to the sciences. And this is called the contemplative part of the soul. And the three sciences for Aristotle, as I told you, are metaphysics, physics, and mathematics. And metaphysics, you remember, is the study of being. So the existence of all things that exist, from the lowest up to God. Now, a very important part of Aristotle's psychology. So psychology is what we call the study of the soul. So the modern term psychology is a bit different to the word we use for studying the soul in ancient times. But a very important aspect of this psychology is that for Aristotle, the contemplative part of the soul is more important than the practical part. So that means that for Aristotle, acting morally is not so important. Leading a morally good life only gives you second-rate happiness. And for Aristotle, the practical part of the soul is only there in order to control the passions. In order to give us the self-control that we need for contemplation. And of course, because we are human beings, we have to live with other human beings. And so when we are dealing with other human beings, we ought to be moral in our actions. But for Aristotle, the purpose of life is not to lead a morally good life. Aristotle is interested in the highest happiness which comes from contemplation. The highest way of life so which is the way of life of the philosopher who devotes his life to the highest sciences, including, of course, some contemplation of God. So this ordering of the parts of the soul has had an enormous influence on the history of philosophy. This ordering of the parts of the soul has had an enormous influence on all of philosophy. Because due to Aristotle, it has been considered that contemplation is more important than moral virtue. Of course, Aristotle inherited this tradition from Pythagoras and Plato, but it is mainly due to Aristotle that it has been considered that the philosophical way of life is the most important. And this, of course, is very striking in the philosophy of the German philosopher Hegel. Also in the Christian tradition, thanks to this philosophy of Aristotle, the idea that contemplation was the highest way of life has also been supported. Although in the Christian tradition a harmony between contemplation and moral virtue is considered an even better way of life. But we find, for example, in Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle's point of view, that the purpose of the moral way of life, so the purpose of the virtues, is to obtain the self-control in order to contemplate. So this is an important aspect of Aristotle's study of the soul. At the start of his life, Aristotle considered that the soul is a substance. So the soul is something real, even though it's immaterial. And also the body is something real. So for Aristotle, at the start of his life, we have body substance and soul substance. And so the human being is a composition of two substances. So this is a little bit different to Plato, because for Plato only the soul is fully real. For Plato, the body is not completely real because nothing in this world is completely real. However, Aristotle probably thought that this idea that the human being is a combination of two substances was not completely satisfactory. No. For Aristotle, he probably thought that the idea that human beings are a combination is not satisfactory. And so we find in his latest work on the soul, which is De Anima, so the De Anima of Aristotle was written certainly in the last 10 years of his life. De Anima is the Latin word for on the soul. And in this last work on the soul, in this De Anima, Aristotle changes his view. Because he decides that he is going to harmonize human beings with every other thing in the world. So you remember that for Aristotle, things are called substances. And he decides then in De Anima that he will make human beings just one substance. So he makes the body the matter and the soul the form. So this is a very big change. Because as I was saying before, the body is something completely real with a matter and form of its own. And then the soul before is also something completely real, although immaterial. But now, in De Anima, he makes the body matter, and the soul becomes the form. So, of course, now human beings are more of a unity. But there's a problem because matter, as we were saying last week, is something that doesn't exist on its own. And form also does not exist on its own, except in the case of God. So this is a very big change. and we'll see the result. But of course it means very clearly that the soul is not able to survive death. Because the form goes together with the matter. You cannot find form without matter. Although later in the Middle Ages, the Christian philosophers will try to find a solution for this problem. So in his De Anima, Aristotle gives a new definition of life. Which is on your handout. In the middle of the first page. He gives the famous definition of the soul. You can see in a little bit larger letters. He says, thus, just 2 lines, the soul is the first entelechy of a natural body potentially having life. So I explained then that entelechy is a Greek word which means realization or actualization. For example, if you are asleep, you are potentially awake. And so when you wake up, that is the first entelechy, the first realization of a potentiality. So he defines the soul as this kind of waking up of the body. So this is a very famous definition, never to be forgotten. There are some difficulties in Aristotle's point of view in De Anima. First of all, we may ask if there's any need for the soul at all. Because the body has a form anyway. And so, why do we need to have a special word called the soul? So clearly, if we use this word, the soul, it must mean that the form of the body is some special kind of form. Because for the form of anything else, I don't have a special word. The form of a table is just a table. form of a human being is the soul. So why do we need this new term, the soul, as the form of a human being? Now, in addition, there is another important change in Aristotle's work on the soul, de anima. And that is Aristotle changes his opinion about the intellect. So you remember that in the early part of his life, I was saying that the intellect is the two highest parts of the soul. The practical part and the contemplative part. But now in his De Anima, Aristotle divides the intellect into a passive part and an active part. So the passive part of the soul is the memory. And this part of the soul will die together with the body. But Aristotle also says there is an active part of the soul. But this active part of the soul, it's either not part of the soul at all, and there's only one active intellect for all of humanity. And so this active part of the soul is a very big problem in Aristotle. And it has had an enormous influence on the whole of philosophy. Because Aristotle does not make clear what he means by the active part of the soul. So it can be called the active intellect. Sometimes it's called by the Latin term intellectus agens. And Aristotle says very little about it. He only talks about it in two very short sentences. But he says that it comes from outside human beings. It is immaterial, and it works as the motor of the soul. So the big question is what exactly it is. So there is a long history of the influence of this active intellect. Some philosophers have thought that it's God working in the human soul. The most important commentator on Aristotle for about 1,000 years after his death was the Greek commentator Alexander of Aphrodisias. Alexander of Aphrodisias. Yes. Aphrodisias is a town today in the west of Turkey. But at that time, the people of Turkey all spoke Greek. And Alexander believes that he interprets the active intellect of Aristotle as being God. And this is a famous viewpoint. And some Christian philosophers also agreed with Alexander. Christian philosophers. Other philosophers in the Arabic tradition had a different interpretation. The great Arabic philosopher, Islamic philosopher Avicenna interpreted the active intellect of Aristotle as a special kind of being which he called the giver of forms. In Latin it's called the dator formarum, the giver of forms. And this intellect gives all forms to human beings when we think. So when we think, we don't develop the forms ourselves. It is the giver of forms that gives us the ideas. And the great Islamic philosopher Averroes in the 12th century believed that this active intellect not only is responsible for our thinking, but even is responsible for our actions, so that we don't have any freedom. So the influence of this active intellect of Aristotle has been enormous in the course of the centuries. Now, In the Middle Ages, the question of how many forms there are in human beings was also dealt with by the famous Jewish philosopher Avicenna. Yes, in the 11th century. The problem again comes from Aristotle, because Aristotle makes human beings a combination of body and soul, form and matter. But of course it's clear that the body seems to have a form of its own. And so the question arises whether human beings don't have two forms, namely the form of the body and the soul. And so the Jewish philosopher Avicenna believed that there is a form for each level of life. So there is a form of the body, then for plants there is a form of the plant. That explains the characteristics of plants. Then another form that explains the characteristics of animals. And yet another form that explains the characteristics of rational life. Rational life, human beings. And so we find in the Middle Ages a big discussion about whether there is more than one form in human beings. So a number of the most important philosophers in the 13th century believed that there is more than one form in human beings. And against this point of view, Thomas Aquinas believed there is only one form in human beings. Namely the rational soul. But he believed that the rational soul is subsistent. Subsistent, that means that it can exist on its own. Because normally a form cannot exist without matter. But Thomas Aquinas believed that the soul is a special kind of form, which at the same time is form of the body, but is also able to survive after the death of the body. Now, for Aristotle, the soul is a self-mover. So he believed that the soul does not need something else to make it start acting. And so, for this reason, he does not believe that the soul is or the actions of the soul are the result of external forces. And that is how he's able to explain, in part, able to explain human freedom. Because the soul is not completely controlled by exterior forces. Now, the question of the soul can be divided into two parts. The first question is the existence of the soul, and the second question is the immortality of the soul. The immortality of the soul is a much more difficult question. Because the immortality of the soul is something that is difficult to show. I mentioned that Plato, St. Augustine, and Kant believed that the soul must be immortal as a matter of justice. Kant. That the soul must be immortal as a matter of justice, as a matter of keeping the harmony in the universe. Other attempts have been made to show the immortality of the soul from the fact that the soul is able to abstract. So an abstraction is not something that exists. And therefore, the argument is that the soul must be immortal because it is able to deal with abstractions. Because only something that is immaterial in itself could deal with abstractions. But these attempts to show the immortality of the soul seem to be rather difficult. Another argument for the immortality of the soul comes from the desire of everybody to be immortal, to survive death. But this argument is rather similar to the argument we had about the justice of rewarding the good and punishing the bad. The argument is that the desire for immortality could not be in vain. Because that would be against the harmony of the universe. It would be the argument that God had made such a perfect universe and given human beings the desire for immortality and would then frustrate them. And then another argument is one from the universal belief in life after death. So peoples from all parts of the world and in all times have believed in the survival of the soul. But again, this is not a proof. It's just an indication. So these are indications, if you like, but the immortality of the soul is something difficult to prove. If you ask me for my own opinion, I would say, because I thought about this quite a bit, you know. I would say that I have no difficulty with the existence of the soul. But it seems to me that in order to achieve the immortality, it would be necessary to transform the soul. So that it would be by leading a good way of life that we would transform our soul. And that this would make the soul able to achieve immortality. Okay, but that's only Dudley, and you don't have to believe Dudley. So I think we have said most of what there is to say about the soul in Aristotle. One important point, though, I would like still to add is that in the modern period, the first modern philosopher, Descartes, Descartes, born 1596, died 1650. Born 1596, died 1650. Made a big change. He reduced the soul from being the soul of all living beings to only human beings. So he believed that only human beings have a soul. And he associated the soul with the human mind. Human mind. So because plants and animals don't have a mind, they also don't have a soul. And so human beings become the exception in the whole universe. Because only human beings have a soul and all other living things do not have soul. But this viewpoint of Descartes is very, very unsatisfactory. First of all, Descartes thinks that animals do not have any soul. So animals for him are just machines. And therefore he would be perfectly entitled to torture animals because he doesn't take any account of their feelings. Also, Descartes' view does not take account of the clear parallel between human beings and other animals. So if we believe in evolution, then it would be very difficult to explain how human beings suddenly have a soul. If animals didn't have a soul already. So it's much more satisfactory to believe that animals have soul. And that when human beings evolved, all that was necessary was for the soul to evolve. When Descartes eliminated the soul in plants and animals, he also eliminated teleology. So he believed that animals and plants do not act for a purpose. So that only human beings act for a purpose. But I think this is a very unsatisfactory point of view. Because it appears that plants and animals, just as much as human beings, do act for the same purpose. Namely, for their full development and for their survival in the best condition. And biologists at the present time also have very big difficulties with the language they use. Because if they follow the viewpoint of Descartes, and if they think that there is no purpose in anything that plants and animals do, then they find it very difficult to explain why animals act the way they do. And so if you see the language used by biologists, they use the language of purpose. They use teleological language. They explain why plants and animals act the way they do. And this explanation of why plants and animals act for a purpose is not possible if there's no soul. Because the reality of soul is the only explanation for purpose in living things. Okay, we'll stop there for today.